Augusta Mercer arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas, on a Tuesday in the spring of 1883 with 43 cents in her coat pocket, a cast-iron skillet strapped to the outside of her traveling bag, and absolutely no intention of staying longer than it took to earn enough money to get herself somewhere else entirely. The town itself was the kind of place that made a person feel the land had been dropped there by accident, like God had simply opened his hand over the dust and let whatever fell land where it wanted. There was a saloon, a general store run by a man named Horace Pickett who squinted at everything as though the sun offended him personally, a church with a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, and a livery stable that smelled so strongly of manure that newcomers tended to step back from it even when they were still half a block away. Redemption Creek was not a place that drew people in. It was a place that people passed through or washed up in when they had nowhere else to wash up. Augusta had washed up here. She had come west from Nashville 18 months ago, following her older brother Samuel, who had written her glowing letters about land and opportunity and the clean, open beauty of Texas. Samuel had died of fever before she arrived, which was the kind of thing the West did to people who trusted it too much too soon. She had stayed in San Antonio for a while, working as a laundress, then in a boarding house in Fredericksburg, where she cooked for the owner's family in exchange for a room barely wide enough to turn around in. Then the owner's wife had decided she did not need a cook after all, and Augusta had found herself on a stage heading further west with 43 cents and her cast-iron skillet, and the stubborn, calcified kind of resilience that grief and hardship had hammered into her over the past year and a half. She was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she wore in a practical knot at the back of her neck, hazel eyes that shifted between green and brown depending on the light, and hands that were already showing the rough calluses of a woman who worked for a living rather than one who merely supervised the working of others. She was not the kind of beautiful that made men stop walking, but she was the kind that made them look twice and then keep looking, which was a more lasting kind of beautiful altogether. She had heard in Fredericksburg that a cattle operation outside Redemption Creek needed a cook for its bunkhouse crew. Word traveled in those days through laundresses and barkeeps and the passengers on stage lines, and the word on this particular job was that the pay was fair, the work was hard, and the boss was difficult. Augusta was not afraid of difficult. Difficult was something she had some experience with. The Cooper Ranch spread out across a generous stretch of land about 4 miles north of town, along a creek that was greener than its name suggested, with cottonwood trees leaning over the water and good grass that came up thick in the spring. It was larger than she had expected, with a proper ranch house built from timber and stone, a long, low bunkhouse, several outbuildings, a barn that looked like it could hold a small army, and corrals that presently contained more horses than she could easily count. It spoke of a man who knew what he was doing with land, who had either inherited sense or worked very hard to acquire it. Augusta had hired a ride out from town in the bed of a supply wagon driven by a gruff but not unkind man named Dutch, who told her approximately nothing about the Coopers except that the old man had died 2 winters back and the son was running things now, and that the previous cook had lasted approximately 3 weeks before departing in what Dutch described as a considerable hurry. "What happened to him?" Augusta asked. "Her," Dutch corrected. "Widow woman. Said Mr. Cooper was too demanding." "Demanding how?" Dutch shrugged with the philosophical indifference of a man who had driven supply wagons for 20 years and had long since lost the capacity for surprise. "Particular, I guess." "About the food." Augusta looked down at her cast-iron skillet strapped to the outside of her bag and decided that being particular about food was not the worst quality in an employer. She arrived at the ranch just before noon and climbed down from Dutch's wagon into a yard that was busy with the kind of organized, purposeful movement that marked a working operation. 2 men were repairing a fence post near the corrals. Another was carrying a saddle toward the barn. A fourth was sitting on the bunkhouse steps, working a piece of tack with a leather punch. And he looked up when she arrived with the particular wariness of a man who had seen too many potential cooks arrive, and then leave again. The ranch house door opened before she had taken 3 steps toward it, and Abel Cooper came out onto the porch. She registered him in pieces, the way you register a person you are already beginning to pay attention to even before you know why. He was tall, which she noticed first because it was impossible not to. Lean but broad through the shoulders in the way that came from years of actual physical work rather than posturing. He had dark hair going slightly long beneath his hat brim, a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than flesh, and eyes so dark a shade of brown they appeared nearly black in the noon shadow of the porch roof. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two on either side. He had a kind of stillness about him that was not the stillness of a lazy man, but the stillness of a man who moved with full intention when he decided to move and saw no reason to be in motion otherwise. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to assess without being obvious about assessing it. "You the cook from Fredericksburg," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, with a cadence that belonged to a man who did not speak unless he had something worth saying. "Augusta Mercer," she said. "I heard you needed someone." He came down off the porch steps and looked at her more directly, and she looked back at him with equal directness because she had not come 4 miles out from town to be evaluated like a piece of livestock. "Previous cook left," he said. "I heard. Said the work was too hard." "The work won't be too hard for me," Augusta said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lives just beneath a smile before a man decides whether or not to let it surface. "You cook for a large crew before." "I cooked for the Hartwell boarding house in Fredericksburg for 11 months. 14 residents plus the family, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Before that I cooked for the Mercer household in Nashville, which is where I grew up, and that household ran to 12 people during harvest season when the workers came in." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "Pay is $12 a month, room in the cook's quarters off the kitchen. Crew eats at 6 in the morning, noon when they come in, and 6 in the evening. Work starts when they need it and stops when it's done." "I'll need a proper pantry," Augusta said. "Well stocked." "I can't cook decent food out of empty shelves. Supply wagon comes every 2 weeks from Horace Pickett's store. You make the list, it gets ordered." "Then we understand each other," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm without performing its firmness, which was exactly the kind of handshake she respected. "Crew's going to be back in at noon," he said. "Might as well start today." She started today. The kitchen was located at the back of the main ranch house, attached by a covered walkway to the bunkhouse so that the men could get their meals without tracking through the ranch house proper. It was a decent-sized room with a wood stove that needed cleaning, a long worktable scarred by years of use, shelves along 2 walls, a pump at the sink that actually worked, and a door that led to a small square room with a cot, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the back of the property toward the creek. The room smelled of old grease and dried herbs. Augusta set her bag on the cot, hung her coat on the hook behind the door, strapped on the canvas apron she always traveled with, and went to see what was in the pantry. The pantry was not well stocked. It was the pantry of a household that had been running without a cook for some weeks and had been making do. There were beans, which was something. There was salt pork. There was flour and cornmeal and a small quantity of dried apples. There was coffee, thank God, because a crew without coffee was a crew in a dangerous state of mind. There was lard, some dried chilies, and a crock of something that turned out to be molasses. Augusta Mercer had cooked for 14 people out of less. She built a fire in the wood stove, soaked the beans in the time she had, fried the salt pork down to render its fat, mixed cornbread batter from the flour and cornmeal, and when the crew of 8 men came riding in at noon, they found a proper meal on the long table in the bunkhouse dining area. Beans with salt pork and dried chilies, fresh cornbread, and coffee so strong and good that a man named Hector, who had been working the Cooper Ranch for 3 years and had eaten his share of poor meals in that time, took one sip and looked at the kitchen doorway with an expression of sincere religious gratitude. Abel Cooper sat at the head of the table, as he always did, and he ate what was in front of him without excessive comment. But Augusta, carrying out the cornbread from the kitchen, saw the way he paused after the first bite, the way he looked at his plate for just a moment before continuing to eat. It was the look of a man who had been expecting something merely acceptable and received something that surprised him, and she filed it away in the practical part of her mind, where she kept information that might be useful. After dinner, the men cleared out back to work, and one of them, a young fellow with sandy hair and an easy grin named Tommy Dawes, who looked to be about 19 and had the unguarded friendliness of a puppy not yet grown into its feet, paused in the kitchen doorway. "That was real fine, Miss Mercer," he said. "Best meal we've had in weeks, and that's the truth." "Thank you, Tommy," she said, because Dutch had told her some of the names on the ride out and she had filed those away as well. Tommy beamed at being recognized and disappeared, and Augusta began the washing up. That evening she made biscuits from scratch, a proper gravy from the last of the salt pork fat, fried potatoes, and a dried apple cobbler that she cooked in the cast-iron skillet that had traveled from Nashville to San Antonio to Fredericksburg, and now to Redemption Creek. She did not know why, but she put an extra measure of effort into the cobbler, perhaps because she wanted to establish something clearly and early about what kind of cook she was. When she carried the cobbler out to the table, Abel Cooper looked at it and then looked at her, and this time the thing beneath the smile came close enough to the surface that she could see its outline. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." She went back to the kitchen and let the men eat. The first week passed in the established rhythm of hard work, which suited Augusta because hard work was what she knew and the rhythm of it gave her a structure within which to think. She learned the crew quickly. Besides Tommy Dawes, there was Hector Reyes, who was about 35, methodical and quiet, and who she discovered spoke better Spanish than English but managed both with equal efficiency. There was a man named Big Bill Sanderson, who was exactly as large as his name suggested and ate proportionately. There was Walt Prout, who was the oldest of the crew at around 50, weathered like old fence wood, and who told her in a confidential tone on the third day that her coffee was the best he had tasted since his mother died 12 years ago, which she understood was a considerable compliment. There was a pair of brothers, Caleb and Eli Marsh, who were not twins but looked enough alike to cause confusion, both of them red-headed and freckled, and inclined toward a kind of good-natured competitive bickering that never actually resolved into anything serious. And there was a man named Darius who said very little, worked very hard, and watched the world with careful dark eyes that had seen enough of it to know better than to trust it immediately, which Augusta understood entirely. She learned Abel Cooper in smaller pieces because he was not a man who presented himself for easy learning. He took his breakfast earlier than the crew, often before full light, which she had not been warned about but adapted to immediately because there was nothing she hated more than a man going to work hungry when she could have prevented it. On the third morning she had his coffee and eggs ready when he came into the kitchen at 5 o'clock, and he stopped in the doorway with a brief, contained surprise before sitting down. "You don't have to be up this early," he said. "I'm already up," she said, which was true. She had always been an early riser. Sleep had been harder in the months since Samuel died, and the pre-dawn quiet of a kitchen was a thing she had come to find more comforting than the restless dark of a bedroom. He drank his coffee and ate his eggs and did not make conversation, which she also respected. There was a category of man who felt that silence needed to be filled at all times and managed this by filling it with whatever happened to be in his head, most of which was not worth saying. Abel Cooper was not that man. On the fourth morning he said, "Your brother was in San Antonio, someone told me, fever." She was at the stove with her back to him, and she took one deliberate breath before she turned around. "Word travels," she said. "This is a small part of the world," he said. He was looking at her with that quiet, direct attention of his, not prying, not pitying, just acknowledging a thing she already knew. "I'm sorry about that." "Thank you," she said, and meant it the way you mean the simple things that are said simply and honestly without flourish. He finished his coffee. "My father died 2 winters ago," he said. "Ranch was his. He built it up from nothing, hard man to follow." He said it without particular emotion, but she could hear, in the careful neutrality of it, that it was something he had not said to many people. The men who wore their grief plainly were easy to understand. The men who kept it level and controlled, who said hard things in quiet voices, those were the ones who had gone deep with it. "Are you following him or building something of your own?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes. "Haven't figured that out yet," he said. He put his hat on and went out to work, and Augusta stood in the kitchen with the first genuinely interesting conversation she had managed to have with anyone in some weeks. The second week brought a problem in the form of a storm that came down out of the northwest and kept the crew penned indoors for 2 days straight. 8 men inside a bunkhouse for 2 days was an experience that tested both patience and pantry, and Augusta found herself cooking nearly continuously, because food was the best management tool available for a group of restless, weather-frustrated cowboys who had nothing to do but argue about card games, and who had eaten the last of their tobacco 2 days before the storm hit. She made sourdough bread from a starter she had found abandoned in the back of a pantry shelf and nursed back to life during the first week. She made a proper stew from the beef that Abel had brought in from the smokehouse before the storm got bad, thick and rich with onions, and the dried herbs she had hung in the kitchen window. She made something she called Cowboy pudding to the crew, which was sweetened cornmeal with molasses and dried fruit. And while it was not a thing any of them would have ordered in a restaurant, there were no restaurants within 40 miles, and it was warm and sweet, and it satisfied something. Abel sat at the big table in the ranch house main room on the afternoon of the second storm day, working through papers that she imagined were the accounts and records of the operation. He did not seem to find the confinement troubling the way the men did, which suggested to her that he was a person who was comfortable in his own company. She brought him coffee without being asked, which she had begun to do more or less automatically, and set it beside him. He looked up and caught her before she could step away. "Sit down if you want," he said. "You've been on your feet for 2 days straight." She sat because her feet were, in fact, telling her things she could not entirely ignore. "The storm comes from the northwest?" she asked. "This time of year, usually," he said. "Another day and it'll break." She looked at the rain hitting the window and sheets. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "I cook better when I understand the place I'm cooking for." He looked at her sideways, not quite buying that explanation, which was fair because it was not entirely the truth. But he talked anyway, which was what mattered. He told her about the land, which had been claimed by his father 18 years ago when it was nothing but grass and possibility. He told her about the cattle, a mixed herd that he was slowly working toward a better bloodline than his father had run, because he had opinions about cattle that he had arrived at through reading and through the kind of careful observation that was more useful than any book. He told her about the water rights, which were the thing he lay awake over at night, because the creek that ran through the property was the same creek that a man named Gerald Fenn was trying to claim a bigger share of from the southern end, and Fenn was a man who understood lawyers better than cattle and was therefore a particular kind of dangerous. "Fenn wants your water," she said. "Fenn wants all of it, the whole creek. If he can push his claim to the creek bed, he can dam it and control the flow south, and I lose enough water that I can't maintain a herd this size through a dry summer. And your father's claim, filed properly. But Fenn's got money and I've got a piece of paper from 1865. He said it without bitterness, just the flat assessment of a man who understood exactly what he was dealing with. "I've hired a lawyer in Austin. We'll see." The storm broke the next morning, as he had said it would, and the work resumed, and Augusta went back to her kitchen and thought about a man who understood water rights and cattle bloodlines, and the pressure of following a father who had built something out of nothing, and she thought about it more than she had intended to. Spring deepened into early summer, and Augusta settled into the life of the Cooper ranch the way water settles into a riverbed, not by force, but by finding the natural lines of the place and following them. She reorganized the pantry and established a list system with Dutch for the supply wagon, gradually improving the range of what she could cook as better provisions became available. She planted a kitchen garden in the patch of ground behind the cook's quarters, because the soil there was good, and she could not stand the idea of cooking without fresh herbs and vegetables when the season allowed for them. Tommy helped her dig the garden bed on a Sunday afternoon when the crew had their half-day off, talking the entire time with the cheerful non-stop energy of a young man who simply had a great deal to say about everything. And she listened with genuine affection because Tommy was the kind of person who made a place feel lighter just by being in it. "Been here almost 3 years," Tommy said, turning the soil with a spade that was slightly too large for him. "Mr. Cooper hired me when I was 16. I was trying to pass myself off as older. Did he know?" "He knew," Tommy said with the grin of a man looking back on his younger self with fond embarrassment. "He hired me anyway. Told me later he figured if someone was hungry enough to lie about his age to get a job, he probably needed the job." Augusta looked up from where she was setting out the herb seedlings she had bought from a woman in town. She thought about Abel Cooper making that assessment, deciding to give the boy a chance based on a quality of character rather than a qualification of age. "He's a fair man," she said. "He's fair," Tommy agreed. "He's also real hard to please, not mean about it, just particular." "Dutch told me that too. You don't seem bothered by it." She pressed a sage plant into the dark soil. "Being particular about things worth being particular about doesn't bother me at all." Tommy looked at her for a moment with an expression that was more perceptive than his general air of cheerful youth usually suggested, and then he went back to digging. What happened by degrees was that Abel Cooper began to talk to her. Not all at once, and not in any way that announced itself as significant. But the early morning coffee became a thing with conversation in it more often than not, and sometimes in the evening he would linger at the table after the crew had gone, and she would bring him a cup of coffee and sit across from him, and they would talk about the things that were happening on the ranch, or the things happening in the wider world as reported by whatever newspapers made their way out from town, or occasionally the things that had happened to each of them in their lives before this particular piece of land. She told him about Nashville, about growing up in a household that was not wealthy but was not poor, about her father who had been a school teacher, and who had given her the particular gift of an interest in things, in understanding how they worked and why. She told him about how Samuel had always been restless, how he had written her letters about Texas with the kind of certainty that people who have never been somewhere carry about it, and how she had believed him because he was her brother and she had always believed him. "Do you miss Nashville?" he asked one evening. She considered the question seriously, because he asked things seriously and deserved the same in return. "I miss what I thought Nashville was going to be," she said, "which I suppose is different from missing a place. I thought I understood what my life was going to look like, and then it looked different and it keeps looking different. Does that frighten you?" "It used to," she said. "Less now." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. He had good hands, she had noticed. The hands of a man who worked with them, scarred and rough in the way of actual use, but careful too. She had seen him handle a frightened horse with those hands, with a patience and gentleness that the horse responded to before the man had made a single sound. "My father always knew exactly what everything was going to look like," he said. "He had a plan for every year, 20 years out. He told me once he could see the ranch in 1900 what it would be, the size of the herd, the buildings, everything." "Could you see it too?" "No," he said. "I see next season and the season after that if I'm lucky. I don't know if that's better or worse." "It's honest," she said. There's something to be said for knowing what you actually know." He looked at her across the table with those dark eyes that seemed to take in considerably more than they gave back, and she felt something in the air between them that she had been pretending not to feel for some weeks now. It was not a comfortable feeling, particularly, but it was not entirely uncomfortable either. It was the feeling of a thing being there that had not asked permission to be there. She got up and collected the coffee cups and went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the sink with the pump water running over her hands and thought about how extremely inconvenient it was to find a person interesting when that person was your employer, and you had not come to this ranch to find anything except a paycheck and enough time to figure out where you were going next. The trouble with the water rights came to a head in July. Gerald Fenn was a man of about 55 with the well-fed look of someone who had prospered without excessive physical effort, and he arrived at the Cooper Ranch on a Wednesday morning with a lawyer from San Antonio and a paper that he claimed superseded the existing claim on the creek. Augusta was in the kitchen and heard voices in the yard and looked out the window and could read trouble in the set of Abel's shoulders before she had heard a word of the conversation. She could not hear the conversation from the kitchen. What she could do was make coffee and carry it out, because carrying coffee gave a woman a reason to be places she otherwise might not have been, and she wanted to know what was happening because it concerned a man whose situation she had apparently begun to care about. She came out with the tray at a moment when Fenn's lawyer was talking about riparian rights in the tones of a man who enjoyed making other people feel ignorant, and Abel was listening with the careful stillness of a man keeping his temper on a very short, very controlled leash. Fenn looked at Augusta with the casual dismissiveness of a man who saw women as furniture when they were not serving a direct purpose, and then looked back at Abel as though she had already ceased to exist. The document from 1865 is superseded by the Territory Survey of 1871, the lawyer was saying. The 1871 survey establishes the creek bed as a shared resource, with use rights determined by acreage abutting the creek. Mr. Fenn's recent acquisition of the Mallory parcel gives him controlling acreage on the southern section. The Mallory parcel was sold with water rights attached, Abel said. Those rights were attached in 1872 after the survey. The attachment was informal, the lawyer said, not legally binding. I have the deed, Abel said, as does Mr. Fenn. The question is which deed takes precedence. Augusta poured coffee with a steady hand and listened and filed away everything she heard because she had grown up in a school teacher's house and she had a good memory for precise language. After Fenn and his lawyer left, Abel stood in the yard for a long moment looking at nothing in particular, and then he looked at Augusta. "How much of that did you hear?" he said. "Enough," she said. "Your lawyer in Austin, does he know about the Mallory deed? He knows about the 1865 claim. He needs to know about the Mallory deed specifically. The informal attachment argument is their weak point. If the water rights were attached in 1872 after the survey, and the survey established shared resource rights, then the attachment goes with the land regardless of how formal it was, because the land was sold with it explicitly included. The buyer cannot claim superior rights based on a document that predates the condition under which the land was sold." Abel looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not yet seen on him, which was something very close to surprise. "Where did you learn about property law?" he said. "My father taught school in Nashville," she said. "He taught everything, including basic law and civic structures, and I paid attention." She picked up the coffee tray. "Write to your lawyer today. Get the Mallory deed into his hands as fast as you can." Abel wrote to his lawyer that afternoon. She saw him at the ranch house desk when she brought his supper, bent over paper with the careful concentration of a man choosing his words precisely. She left the supper and did not disturb him. The response from the lawyer came 10 days later, brought out by Dutch with the supply wagon. Augusta was in the garden when Abel came around the side of the house with the letter open in his hand and the look of a man who has just been told that a weight he has been carrying is lighter than he thought. He says the Mallory detachment is exactly the argument he needed, Abel said. He's filing a response to Finn's claim this week. He says he's confident. Good, Augusta said. He was standing at the edge of the garden with the afternoon sun behind him, and he looked at her in a way he had not looked at her before, a way that was open rather than contained, like a door he had been keeping closed had come open slightly without his permission. You may have saved this ranch, he said. You would have figured it out, she said. Maybe. Eventually, he paused. Thank you, Augusta. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded different in his voice than it did in her own head, which was something she wished she were better at ignoring. You're welcome, she said, and turned back to the garden. In August, the heat came down on Redemption Creek like a heavy hand and did not let up. The work of the ranch continued despite it, because cattle did not pause for heat, and the grass needed cutting for winter hay, and there were fences that needed repair along the far northern boundary where the land rose toward rocky ground. The crew worked from before dawn until the worst of the afternoon heat, and then again in the cooler evening hours, and Augusta adjusted her cooking schedule accordingly, making the big hot meals in the early morning when the kitchen was bearable, and preparing cold supper food in the relative cool of dawn, so that the midday and evening meals required only assembly. She had been at the Cooper Ranch for 3 months now, and she had not, she noticed, made any particular progress on determining where she was going next. She noticed this without immediate alarm. She had been earning her pay and saving it. She had $12 a month coming in, and her room and food were covered, which meant that she was actually accumulating something for the first time since she had left Nashville. That was practical. The practical reason to stay was entirely sound. She did not examine too closely whether there were other reasons. What happened in August was a smaller thing than the water rights and a larger thing at the same time, the way the things that actually change a situation often are. One evening after supper, when the crew had gone to the bunkhouse, and the night was still warm but finally breathable, Augusta was sitting on the back step of the cook's quarters in the last of the light. She had a book she had borrowed from Abel's shelf, a collection of observations on natural history that she had found unexpectedly absorbing, and she was reading it in the manner of a person who has done enough work for the day and is allowing herself a quiet hour. Abel came around from the barn, leading a bay mare that was limping slightly on her right foreleg, and he stopped when he saw Augusta on the step, and she looked up from the book. "Picked up a stone," he said, meaning the horse, as he passed. "Already got it out, just walking her a little." She watched him lead the mare slowly across the yard, talking to the horse in a low, even voice that she could not quite make out, the kind of talk that was not about words but about tone, about the constant, steady reassurance of a voice that meant well. The horse moved with trust beside him, not pulling or skittish, just slightly cautious of the sore leg. "She's beautiful," Augusta said. He stopped and looked back. "Her name's Clara. She's been with me since before my father died, probably the best horse I've had." "How old is she?" 10. "Good years left yet." He stroked the mare's nose with a kind of unguarded tenderness that she had not yet seen in him, the particular softness of a person with something they love without reservation. She went back to her book, or appeared to. He continued walking Clara around the yard in slow, patient circles, and the darkness came down slowly, and the night sound started up, frogs from the direction of the creek and a mockingbird somewhere in the cottonwoods, and it was one of those evenings where being exactly where you are feels like something you did not plan but find yourself grateful for anyway. "What are you reading?" he asked at some point. She told him. He made a sound of interest and came to sit on the fence railing nearby, Clara standing quietly beside him, and she read him a passage about the navigation of birds that she had found particularly interesting, and he listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. And when she was done, he said that he had always thought there was something like a kind of intelligence in birds that people underestimated, and she said she thought the same, and they talked about birds for a while in the warm dark. Later, when she went inside, She sat on her cot for a moment with the book in her hands and thought about the word later, specifically the phrase later than planned, and how it applied to the fact that she had been on the Cooper ranch for 3 months and her plans, such as they had been, seemed to be getting steadily vaguer while her days here seemed to be getting steadily clearer. She was not a foolish woman. She understood what was happening in the way that intelligent people understand things they are not yet ready to fully acknowledge, obliquely, from the corner of the eye, without turning to look at it directly. The first day of September brought a different kind of day to the ranch. It began with Tommy coming into the kitchen at breakfast looking worried, which was unusual because Tommy's natural state was somewhere between hopeful and delighted. "Ryder came in from the south this morning," Tommy told her in a low voice while she plated the biscuits. "Fenn's man told Mr. Cooper that Fenn's claiming there's a new survey being done and he's going to stop the water before winter." Augusta set down the biscuit pan. "Stop the water how?" "Divert it. There's a place on the south section where the creek bends. If he puts a dam structure there, he can redirect the flow into his own land and cut off about 1/3 of our water supply." "Can he do that legally while the claim is being disputed?" Tommy lifted his hands in a gesture that communicated that these were the kinds of questions above his understanding. Augusta carried the breakfast out, and when Abel came to the table she looked at him, and she could tell from the set of his jaw that the morning had not been an easy one. She poured his coffee and sat down across from him, which she did not always do at the breakfast table, but did this morning without hesitation. "Tommy told me about Fenn's man," she said. "He's posturing," Abel said, "trying to force a settlement before the court ruling comes. Would a settlement be bad? The settlement he wants would be. He wants first rights on the southern section, which means he controls volume through the summer dry months. I lose 1/3 of my water capacity in the months I need it most." "Then you don't settle," she said. "No," he said. He drank his coffee. "I wrote to my lawyer again yesterday. He says the court is moving on our filing. We need 3 weeks, maybe 4. Then you wait 3 weeks, and you keep an eye on that bend in the creek." He looked at her across the table, and the look was warm in a way that he probably did not intend to be as visible as it was. "You think like someone who has run something," he said. "I ran a household for 10 years, she said. "A household is a small operation. The principles are the same. My mother ran this house for 15 years, he said. "She died when I was 12. I don't think I've ever understood what that meant until recently." She held his gaze. "Where did you go after she died?" "I stayed," he said. "My father needed the help and there was no one else. I was the only one." He paused. "It's a thing that shapes you, learning that young that you can't wait for someone else to do the necessary thing." She thought about her own shaping, about Nashville and Samuel and the hard months since, about the way necessity teaches you lessons that ease cannot. She thought about how people arrived at who they were through what had happened to them and what they had done with it, and how sometimes you met a person and could see in them the long work of becoming someone, could see the seams where they had been repaired. "I think you're more your own man than you give yourself credit for," she said. "Your father built the foundation. What you build on it is yours." The court ruled in Abel's favor in the 3rd week of September. The letter came with Dutch's supply wagon on a Thursday morning, and this time Augusta was in the kitchen when Abel came in with it, and she could tell from the way he was holding himself, from the fractional loosening of something in his shoulders, what the letter said before he showed it to her. He held it out across the kitchen table. "We won," he said. She read the lawyer's summary with the same careful attention she gave to everything worth reading. The court had found that the Mallory deed attachment was legally binding under the conditions of the 1872 sale, that Fenn's claim to controlling acreage rights was not supported by the subsequent deeds, and that the creek remained a shared resource with use rights as originally established in the 1865 claim, intact. "You won," she said. "We won," he said, and the emphasis was quiet but deliberate. She looked up from the letter and found him watching her with an expression that was fully open now. None of the careful containment she had grown used to reading past, just the direct warmth of a man looking at someone he is grateful to in more ways than one. She became aware that they were alone in the kitchen, which was not unusual in itself, as they were alone in the kitchen most early mornings. What was different was the absence of the particular pretense they had both been maintaining, the pretense of nothing, of employer and employee and the useful professional relationship therein. "Augusta," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not quite an answer to a question that hadn't been asked, but seemed to be the right thing to say anyway. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, which was a thing she had not expected from a man of his particular brand of careful deliberateness, and he took her hand in both of his and held it with the same steadiness he held everything, and he said, "I need to say something to you." "Then say it," she said. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I know you came here thinking it was temporary. I know you've been here 5 months, and I've never said anything because I didn't know how, or because I thought maybe it wasn't my place, or because I was afraid of getting it wrong. But you saved this ranch, and you fed my crew, and you made this place feel like something it hasn't felt like since my mother died, and I think somewhere in the last 5 months I've stopped being able to picture this place without you in it." Her heart was doing something undignified and thoroughly inconvenient inside her chest. "You're a difficult man to work for," she said, because she was not a woman who let herself be swept away without at least a moment of honest reckoning. "I know," he said. "You're particular about things." "I am," he said. "I'm particular about things that matter. The last cook left after 3 weeks. You're still here after 5 months," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man with his dark eyes and his careful hands, and his way of saying the hard thing plainly, who had talked to her about birds in the dark and cattle bloodlines in the morning, and who had lost his mother at 12 and his father 2 winters ago, and was building something on the foundation of both of them with the materials he had, who had looked at her from the first day with the particular attention of a person recognizing something worth paying attention to. "I don't want to leave," she said. "I haven't found a reason to." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a formality and tenderness that struck her somewhere deep in the chest, and she thought, not for the first time in her life, that the things you did not plan were very often the best ones. The crew noticed, because crews always notice. Tommy noticed first and could not contain his delight about it, which expressed itself as an inability to stop smiling during meals for approximately a week. Hector noticed and said nothing. But when he passed Augusta in the yard one morning, he tipped his hat to her with a gravity and warmth that communicated everything. Walt Prout told her directly that it was about time, in the voice of a man who had been waiting for someone else to figure out what he had known for months. The Marsh brothers made a bet about something. She could not determine what, and Caleb appeared to win it, judging by Eli's expression at the supper table. Big Bill looked between them at the meal table one afternoon and nodded slowly with the manner of a man confirming a thing he had already concluded. Darius, who said the least of all of them, caught her eye across the yard one day and offered her a single, quiet nod that she understood as the most sincere form of approval available from a man who gave it sparingly. What changed between them changed gradually, and then all at once, the way that things gather momentum when they have been building for longer than either party fully acknowledged. Abel began to take his supper in the kitchen sometimes, at the small table there rather than the big table in the main room, and they would eat together and talk. And the talking was easy in the way that talking is easy between 2 people who have spent months learning each other's language without realizing that was what they were doing. He showed her more of the ranch, things she had not yet seen, the far northern boundary where the land rose and the view from the ridge showed the whole spread of the property, the creek where it ran clear and cold even in the heat of summer, the back section of the barn where he kept a collection of his father's tools alongside his own, the old oak tree at the edge of the property that he told her he had climbed as a boy and that his father had climbed as a boy before him. "He planted it," Abel said. "His father planted it, my grandfather. It was the first thing anyone planted on this land." She put her hand on the bark, rough and warm from the sun. "That's something," she said. "It's the only thing of his I'm completely sure about," he said. "The tree doesn't argue about water rights." She laughed, a real laugh, and it surprised him into his own, and they stood there under the old oak in the early fall afternoon and laughed together, which was its own kind of intimacy. October brought a coolness to the mornings that made the kitchen pleasant again, the heat from the stove welcome rather than oppressive, and Augusta put up preserves from the kitchen garden's end-of-season abundance. She had grown tomatoes and squash and beans and herbs, and a patch of melons that had done better than she had hoped, and the jars lined up along the pantry shelf were a kind of satisfaction she could not easily articulate but felt deeply. Abel stood in the pantry doorway one evening looking at those jars with an expression she could not immediately read. "My mother used to put up preserves," he said. "Same shelves." She did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that would not be either inadequate or excessive. "I'll make sure the tomatoes are put up right," she said finally, "for winter." He crossed the pantry in one step and kissed her, which was not the first time he had kissed her because there had been evenings on the back porch and one afternoon near the creek and a morning when the frost was on the ground, and she had come out with his coffee, and he had taken the cup, and then looked at her in the cold, clear air, and kissed her before she had finished being cold. But this kiss in the pantry, surrounded by the jars she had put up, tasted like everything that had been building since May, and it was the kind of kiss that rearranged something. "I want to ask you something," he said when they stepped back. "Then ask," she said, for the second time applying the same philosophy. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not in the pantry." "There's nothing wrong with the pantry," she said. He looked at her with that almost smile. "There are better places." He asked her properly on a Sunday, on the ridge above the north boundary where the view spread out below them, the ranch and the creek and the land turning toward autumn gold, in the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look like a painting. He did not kneel, which she respected, because he was a man who lived on his knees enough in the daily work of a ranch, and this was not a moment for performance. He stood in front of her and held both her hands and looked at her in the direct, unguarded way that she had come to understand as the fullest expression of who he was, and he asked her to stay. Not just to stay as the cook, not just to stay as the person he was falling in love with, which was a thing they had already been saying to each other in the language of mornings and evenings and conversations and hands found in the dark, but to stay as his wife, as his partner in this particular piece of the world, as the person he was building something with. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, which was how she knew it was completely true, because she was not a woman who said important things without meaning them. They were married in the church in Redemption Creek on the 14th of November, 1883, on a morning when the sky was the particular deep blue of a clear western autumn day, and there was a light wind from the north that was cold but not unpleasant. The Reverend Mills, who had been performing marriages in Redemption Creek for 12 years and had grown accustomed to the practical, unceremonious nature of ranch country weddings, performed the service with a genuine warmth that Augusta had not entirely expected. The entire crew attended, in their best clothes and with varying degrees of success in the matter of having properly groomed their hair. Tommy had slicked his so thoroughly that it appeared to be made of wood, and was so visibly moved throughout the ceremony that Walt, standing beside him, handed him a handkerchief at some point that Tommy accepted without shame. Hector had brought a small silver pin that had belonged to his mother, which he pressed into Augusta's hand before the service with a few quiet Spanish words that she did not entirely understand, but felt completely. Big Bill sat in the front pew and looked like a mountain in a good shirt. The Marsh brothers argued briefly in whispers about the correct words to some hymn they both half remembered, and were silenced by a look from Darius that communicated the kind of authority that comes from genuinely not caring about either brother's opinion on the matter. Horace Pickett from the general store attended, squinting as always. Dutch attended and sat in the back row with the expression of a man who had contributed something to this outcome and knew it, although his contribution had been primarily in the form of information transmitted on the bench of a supply wagon. A few women from town attended too, including a Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who ran the town's only millinery, and who had been quietly kind to Augusta on the occasion she had come to town for supplies, and who now sat with a handkerchief of her own that she deployed with rather more elegance than Tommy. Gerald Finn did not attend, which was entirely appropriate since the court ruling had settled his position on all matters related to Abel Cooper's ranch. Abel stood beside her at the altar in his good dark coat with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with the full force of those dark eyes. And when the Reverend asked him if he would take Augusta Mercer as his wife, he said yes with a plainness and certainty that made even the Reverend look moved. She looked back at him when the Reverend asked her the same, and said yes with the same plainness and certainty, and felt the irreversibility of it like a door closing behind her on a version of herself that had arrived in Redemption Creek with 43 cents and a cast-iron skillet, and no intention of staying. They had a wedding meal at the ranch that afternoon, which Augusta had planned and largely cooked herself, because some things you did not delegate, and this was one of them. She had made a roast that had been going in the oven since morning, and fresh bread and preserves from the pantry jars, and a pie that she was particularly proud of, and the crew ate and drank, and the afternoon was exactly what it should be, warm and a little loud and full of people being genuinely happy for two of their own. Walt made a toast that was brief and heartfelt, and concluded with the observation that the coffee had improved considerably since May, which was not the most traditional of wedding toasts, but was received with the sincerity it deserved. Tommy made a toast that lasted considerably longer and covered a range of topics including the nature of love, the excellence of various meals he had eaten in the past 6 months, and a meandering tribute to the kitchen garden that somehow arrived, eventually, at the correct emotional destination. Abel sat at the table with his wife beside him and his hand over hers on the tablecloth, and he looked at everything around him with the particular expression of a man who did not take good things for granted. Winter came in earnest in December, and the ranch settled into the slower rhythm of the cold months. The cattle were moved to the lower pastures where the water did not freeze as quickly, and the work shifted from the driving pace of the warmer seasons to a steadier maintenance of what was already established. The bunkhouse was warmer than summer, the stove running day and night, and Augusta's kitchen was the warmest room on the property, which meant that the doorway between the kitchen and the covered walkway was frequently occupied by someone or other seeking the combination of warmth and the smell of something cooking. She adapted to being Mrs. Cooper in the way she adapted to most things, which was to assess what it actually required, and then do those things fully. What it required was not very different from what she had already been doing, with the significant addition of a life that was no longer just hers to manage, but theirs together. She and Abel talked in the mornings over coffee, not just as two people who worked together, but as two people who were building a shared thing, a life in the particular sense of the word that includes all of it, the daily decisions and the longer plans and the fears kept quiet and the hopes spoken aloud. She learned more of who he was in the winter months than in all the busy activity of the other seasons, because winter gave them time, which was its own kind of gift. She learned that he read more than he let on, that the shelves in the ranch house were full of books that he had worked through systematically, history and natural science and philosophy, and the occasional novel that he had read with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. She learned that he had a particular quality of patience with things that went wrong, a kind of steadiness in the face of difficulty that was not indifference but something more like faith in eventual resolution, which she suspected had been beaten into him by the hard years of learning to run a ranch alone. She learned that he laughed, genuinely and freely in the right circumstances, and that the right circumstances came more frequently now than they apparently had before. She told him things she had not told anyone in Texas, about her father and his books and the way he had taught her to be interested in the world, about her mother, who had died when Augusta was 17, and whom she had missed in the particular way you miss the person who taught you how to be yourself. About Samuel, not just the grief of his death but the warmth of who he had been, his confidence and his restlessness and his genuine belief that things were going to be better somewhere else, which had not been entirely wrong, just not survivable in the form he had attempted it. "I think he would have liked it here," she said one evening in January, and she meant both the ranch and the life, and Abel, who had been listening with his whole attention, said quietly that he thought so too. By February she knew she was pregnant, which she knew in the way women of that era learned such things, through the accumulated evidence of a body telling a story it had told before and would tell again. She told Abel on a morning in early February when the ground outside was hard with frost and the creek was running low and clear through its ice-edged banks, when they were sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, and the ranch was still quiet around them. She told him simply, as she told him most things. He put down his cup and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one of the most undefended things she had ever seen on a human being. It was not a performed joy, not the exaggerated response of a man demonstrating what he thought was expected. It was something that came up from somewhere genuinely deep, a look of quiet, profound happiness mixed with something like awe. He got up from his chair and came around the table and put his arms around her with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man handling something of enormous value. And he held her there in the kitchen in the February morning, and she felt the steadiness of him against her, the solid warmth of a man who intended to be exactly where he was. And she pressed her face against his shoulder, and understood with absolute clarity that the 43-cent journey and the cast-iron skillet and the grief and the Fredericksburg boarding house and Dutch's supply wagon had all been taking her, in the inexplicable and non-negotiable way of such things, exactly here. Spring came back around to the Cooper Ranch in 1884 with all the thoroughness that second springs carry. The sense of the world doing something again that it does every year, but somehow meaning it more than it did the last time. The kitchen garden was planted earlier than the year before because Augusta had made careful notes through the winter about what had done well and what had needed adjustment, and the improved planning showed in the neat, confident rows of seedlings that came up in late March. Tommy helped with the garden again, with the same cheerful energy as before, but now with the comfortable ease of a habit rather than a first attempt, and he talked while he worked about a girl in town named Clara, the name of Abel's mare, which Tommy acknowledged was perhaps why he had noticed her initially, and which had become its own kind of delightful coincidence. He talked about her with the mixture of joy and terror that characterized the beginning of love in a young man who has not yet learned to be casual about it. And Augusta listened, and did not make him feel foolish about any of it, because she remembered exactly that feeling and knew it was not foolish at all. "Does she know you're interested?" Augusta asked. "I think she might," Tommy said. "I've managed to talk to her 3 times without making a complete disaster of it." 3 times is a solid foundation, Augusta said. "Mr. Cooper talked to you every morning for months before anything happened," Tommy said, and then looked alarmed at his own boldness. Augusta smiled. "That's true," she said. "How did you know? That it was real, I mean. That it was worth, risking." She pressed a tomato seedling into the soil and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I knew," she said slowly, "because I could see who he was. Not just who he was being. And I liked who he was, genuinely, in the way you like something that is what it is without pretense. And I thought, this is someone worth being known by." She looked up. "Find someone worth being known by, Tommy. That's the whole thing." Tommy looked at her with an expression that suggested he was filing this information under important. Abel's son was born in October of 1884. A healthy boy who arrived in the world with a set of lungs that made his opinions immediately known, which suggested to Augusta that he was going to be a person with views about things, which she found reassuring. Abel sat beside her afterward with the boy in his arms and looked at this new person with the same quality of careful attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, studying the small face with a thoroughness that was both tender and slightly wondering, as though he were trying to work out something fundamental about how the world was organized, and had decided this child was the best available evidence. They named him James Cooper, after Abel's father, which Abel had not suggested but which Augusta had arrived at on her own and proposed to him quietly, and the way he received it told her that she had gotten it exactly right. James was also, she noted privately, the name of her own father, which made it feel even more correct, a name that honored both directions from which this child had come. James Cooper was not a quiet infant, which the crew took in stride with varying degrees of success. Tommy, predictably, was enchanted and could be found at the kitchen door with no plausible excuse in alarming frequency. Hector carved a small wooden horse and left it on the kitchen table without comment. Walt said the boy had good strong lungs and would make a fine hand someday, which was the highest praise available in his vocabulary. Big Bill simply looked at the baby with an expression of profound gentleness that was slightly startling given the physical scale of the man. Darius, on the occasion of the one time he looked closely at the baby, said only, "Good," and walked away, which from Darius constituted a full endorsement. The Marsh brothers argued about whose turn it was to bring firewood to the kitchen now that Mrs. Cooper had a baby to tend to, which was the form their helpfulness took and was entirely typical of them. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the warmest either of them could remember for the season, which meant the cattle stayed healthier and the workload was lighter, and the ranch house was full of a different kind of life than it had been before. The sound of a baby discovering that making noise was interesting, the smell of cooking that was now aimed at a household as well as a crew, the morning conversations that now sometimes included the particular logistics of sleep deprivation, which Abel managed with the same stoic patience he applied to difficult weather and water rights disputes. He was a good father, which she had suspected he would be, but was moved to see confirmed in the daily reality of it. He had his father's hands and his father's land and his mother's oak tree, and his own particular careful way of paying attention. And he turned all of that on his son with a consistency and warmth that made James Cooper, who had arrived in the world with opinions, gradually develop the opinion that the world was a trustworthy place. The water rights victory, now fully settled with Finn having withdrawn his counterclaim in November of 1883, had allowed Abel to put the energy previously spent on that anxiety into actual expansion of the operation. By the spring of 1885, he had added a dozen more cattle to the herd, improved the breeding stock, and hired a ninth hand for the crew, a quiet young man named Garrett who came from somewhere in the hill country and had a reputation for being good with horses that turned out to be entirely accurate. The ranch was growing. It was visible in the condition of the buildings, which were better repaired than they had been when Augusta arrived, and in the quality of the stock, and in the way the crew operated, with the confident efficiency of people who worked for someone they respected and were treated fairly. It was visible, too, in the kitchen garden, which had doubled in its second year, and now included a small fruit orchard that Abel had started from tree stock ordered through Horace Pickett, 3 apple trees and 2 plum trees planted along the south-facing wall of the cook's quarters, which would not produce significantly for another few years, but which were already putting on their spring blossoms with a determination that promised something. Augusta looked at those blossoms one morning in April of 1885, James on her hip because he was 11 months old, and had recently discovered that mobility was a thing he was capable of, and preferred to express it continuously. And she thought about how this place had looked when she arrived, the depleted pantry and the thin crew, and the man on the porch assessing her with those careful dark eyes. Abel came up beside her, which she heard before she felt his hand at her back because she had become attuned to his particular way of moving, and he looked at the blossoming trees with the satisfaction of someone watching a thing become what it was always meant to be. 3 more years, he said, meaning the apples. 3 more years, she agreed. James made a decisive sound and reached for his father, and Abel took him with the fluid ease of a man who had adapted to fatherhood more quickly than he had probably anticipated. And James grabbed Abel's hat and pulled it sideways, and Abel righted it with one hand without breaking the look he was giving Augusta, which was warm and clear, and the look of a man who knows exactly where he is and wants exactly to be there. The summer of 1885 brought a new kind of event to Redemption Creek, which was the establishment of a proper school. It had been a thing the town had been discussing for years, and what finally brought it into being was a combination of the arrival of several new families in the area, the donation of a lot by one of the older landowners who had more civic feeling than he usually let on, and the organized effort of a small number of women in town, among whom Augusta Cooper played a role that she described to Abel as minor and which was, by any objective accounting, somewhat more than that. She had attended 3 meetings in town over the summer, riding in with Abel on supply days, and she had used the same quality of organized, direct thinking that she applied to pantry management and water rights to the question of what a proper school needed, which was a teacher and a curriculum and a building, in that order. The teacher was found through correspondence with a school in Austin. The building was the donated lot plus the labor of several men from the surrounding ranches, including a weekend in July, when Abel and the whole Cooper crew turned up and built walls and a roof with a will that would have been touching if it had not also been tremendously efficient. The curriculum was a thing Augusta drafted from memory and from her father's old methods, written out in careful longhand and sent to Austin for review. She thought about her father through all of it, about a man who had taught school for 30 years and believed with unshakable conviction that the ability to understand things was the most valuable gift one person could give another. He would have loved this, she told Abel on the drive home from the school's first day of classes, James asleep in the back of the wagon on a folded blanket. "Tell me more about him," Abel said. She did on that drive home through the September afternoon, and it was the telling of it that made her understand something she had been carrying without fully knowing its weight, that grief does not prevent love and love does not prevent grief, and that both of them are part of the same human capacity for caring deeply about things, which was not a burden but, in the end, the whole point. Abel listened to her talk about her father the way he listened to everything important, with his whole attention, and when she had finished he said, "I think I would have liked him very much," and she believed him. James took his first clear, deliberate steps in October, 3 steps across the kitchen floor toward Augusta, who was crouching at the other end with her hands out, and the expression on his face when he arrived was the expression of someone who has just discovered that the world is larger than he thought, and he has the means to navigate it, which was a fine expression to see on a child not yet a year old. Tommy, who happened to be passing the kitchen door at the moment, witnessed this event and reacted as though he had personally observed something of historic significance, which caused Abel, who had been leaning against the far wall watching with a quieter version of the same feeling, to look at Tommy with the warm exasperation of a man who finds the enthusiasm of the young both endearing and mildly exhausting. Tommy, incidentally, had by this point managed more than 3 conversations with the girl named Clara from town, and was in the advanced stages of something that anyone watching could clearly see was mutual. He had told Augusta about it with increasing frequency through the summer, and she had listened each time with genuine interest and offered practical advice where she could. And by October, it was evident to the entire crew that Tommy Dawes was a young man with significant plans. He asked Abel if he might bring Clara to Sunday dinner at the ranch in November. And Abel, who had a particular quality of affection for Tommy that he expressed through dry observation rather than sentiment, said that he supposed one more person at the table would not be catastrophic, which Tommy correctly understood as enthusiastic approval. Clara turned out to be a bright-eyed, practical young woman of 20 who managed her widowed father's household with competence and good humor, and she and Augusta recognized each other within approximately 10 minutes as two women of similar practical intelligence and mutual good instinct. And they sat at the table after dinner and talked while Abel and Tommy discussed horses in the yard. And it was the beginning of a friendship that Augusta had not expected, but was grateful for in the way she was grateful for the apple trees. Evidence that good things kept arriving whether or not you had made specific plans for them. The winter of 1885 arrived early and hard, which the ranch was better prepared for than it had been in previous years. The pantry was stocked from the summer's abundance. The hay was cut and stored. The cattle were in good condition, and the bunkhouse was tight against the wind. Augusta managed the winter stores with the careful arithmetic of someone who had spent enough time in scarcity to take abundance seriously. And the crew ate well through December and January, and into February when the worst cold came. Abel spent more time in the ranch house through those months, working on the accounts and planning the spring operations, and Augusta worked alongside him more directly than she had before, not just in the kitchen but in the plans themselves. She had a head for figures and a practical imagination for the kind of forward planning that a working ranch required, and Abel had come to see this not as an unusual thing for a wife to contribute, but simply as one of the resources available to him, which was the way she preferred to be seen. They talked about the future on winter evenings when James was asleep and the fire was going and the wind was at the windows, and the future they talked about had a shape and a direction that was built from real knowledge rather than optimism. They talked about the herd and the water and the land, about the school in town and what they wanted for James, about the possibility of adding to the land itself, a section to the east that was coming available if the current owner decided to sell. "Your father would recognize this ranch," Augusta said one evening. "He would know it was his, but he would see it's become something else too." Abel looked at her across the firelight. "What has it become?" She thought about how to say what she saw, the way the place had changed, not just in its practical improvements but in its character, in the quality of life within it. "It's become a home," she said, "not just a working operation, a place where people want to be." He reached across and took her hand. "Because of you," he said. "Because of us," she said, "which is different and better." He brought her hand to his lips again in the way he had done in the kitchen in September of 1883, on the day of the court ruling, and she felt across that gesture the whole arc of what had been built, from the woman who had climbed off Dutch's supply wagon with 43 cents and no plan to stay, to the woman sitting here in this house that was hers as much as it was anyone's, with a son asleep upstairs and a husband across from her and a crew of 8 men who were, in their varied and individual ways, people she had come to care about genuinely and who had come to care about her. The East Section land became available in the spring of 1886 when its owner, a man named Corley who had been trying to make a go of it alone for 4 years and had finally concluded that his particular future did not lie in ranching, decided to sell. Abel bought it at a fair price, which extended the Cooper Ranch's reach by a significant portion and gave them access to a secondary water source, a spring-fed pond at the eastern edge of the new property that was reliable through even the driest summers. The expansion required adding 2 more hands to the crew, and among the new men was a fellow named Joseph, who was about 30, a careful, experienced hand who turned out to be from Louisiana originally, and who brightened visibly when Augusta produced proper cornbread, which she took as both a compliment and a bond. She was pregnant again by the summer of 1886, which she was not surprised by and which Abel received with the same profound, unperformed happiness as the first time, which she appreciated because some men managed the first with great feeling, and the second as though it were a matter of course. It was not a matter of course to him. She could tell by the way he watched her across rooms, by the way his hand found her shoulder in the mornings, by the way he said her name when they were alone together, with a particular quality of warmth that she knew was not about the pregnancy specifically but about her, and about what she meant to him, and about the fact that love, properly understood, was not a single event but a continuous practice. The second child arrived in February of 1887, another boy, which Abel received with joy and Augusta received with the observation that the Cooper ranch was apparently producing boys, which was fine with her because James was excellent, and she had every reason to expect his brother would be similarly worthwhile. They named him William, for no one specific but for the simple reason that it was a good strong name that suited him when they looked at him, which was, Augusta held, the best reason to name anyone anything. James was 2 years old when William arrived, and took an interest in his brother that expressed itself primarily in a desire to poke him, which was managed with patience and redirected into the more constructive activity of fetching things, at which James proved surprisingly capable and enthusiastic. James was a child who was already showing his father's quality of careful attention and his mother's directness, a combination that suggested he would be a person with considerable force of character, which everyone who knew his parents found entirely predictable. Tommy Dawes married Clara that spring, a small wedding in Redemption Creek's church on an April morning when the wildflowers were going in the grass along the roadsides. Augusta stood with Clara as her witness, and felt the fullness of a circle that had started with Tommy digging a garden bed and talking without stopping, and she thought about how the things you do without knowing their importance are very often the most important things you do. Abel stood with Tommy, because Abel was not the kind of man who made a young person feel alone at the moments that counted, and Tommy looked at Clara through the whole ceremony with the expression of a man who still could not quite believe his luck, which was, Augusta thought, the right way to look at someone you loved, the way you would look if you were paying attention. Hector brought his fiddle to the wedding celebration, and it turned out he could play it with a skill that no one had previously known about because there had not been sufficient occasion, and the afternoon was very much livelier than expected, and Darius danced once with Mrs. Eleanor Vance from the millinery, which was the most surprising thing Augusta had witnessed since arriving in Texas, and which she relayed to Abel later that evening with such delight that he laughed in the complete, unguarded way she loved most in him. The Cooper Ranch of 1887 was a different place from the depleted, half-managed operation Augusta had ridden up to in May of 1883. It was larger and better equipped and better staffed, and the cattle were of finer quality, and the books were in better order, and the pantry was never empty, and the kitchen garden had become something that people in town had apparently begun to ask about, because Horace Pickett's wife had stopped Augusta in the general store that summer and asked for advice on herb growing with a directness that suggested the reputation of Augusta's garden had preceded her. She gave the advice freely, because her father had taught her that knowledge shared was the only kind that grew. In the evenings of that summer, when the work was done and James was asleep, and William was in the cradle, Abel and Augusta sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the last of the light, which was something they had done more and more as the years settled around them. The view from the porch was the yard and the corrals, and beyond them the land rolling toward the creek and the cottonwoods, and in the late summer the light went long and gold across all of it in a way that made the world look like something you would want to keep forever. They did not always talk on those evenings. Sometimes they simply sat, in the comfortable silence of two people who had run out of the need to fill every moment with words, because they knew who they were to each other, without requiring constant confirmation. It was the most specific kind of peace, the kind that is not absence but presence, the kind that is built from years of deliberate attention to what matters and patient letting go of what does not. Augusta thought sometimes in those evenings about the woman who had arrived with 43 cents and a cast-iron skillet. She thought about her with affection and something close to gratitude because that woman had kept going when going was hard, had cooked good food out of thin pantries, had paid attention to things worth paying attention to, and had, in the end, not left when she did not find a reason to. She had never found a reason to leave, and now she could not imagine one. The cast-iron skillet still lived in her kitchen, in the same place she had put it on the first day. She still used it most mornings for the crew's breakfast, and on Sundays for the cobbler that Abel had always had a particular appreciation for. It was seasoned now to the black, perfect condition of a skillet that has been used by someone who knows how to care for a good thing, and it would last, she thought, well beyond both of them. By 1888 James was 3 and walking with the determined confidence of a small person who has concluded that the world is his to explore, and William was 1 and beginning to develop opinions about everything, which did not surprise Augusta at all, and the ranch was in the best condition it had been in since Abel's father had built it. The water rights were settled, and the herd was strong, and the crew was good, and the lawyer in Austin sent a note every few months confirming that Fenn had made no further legal moves, which was entirely expected since losing the first dispute had apparently convinced him to direct his attention to matters that were not guaranteed to go against him. The east section was fully integrated into the operation now, and the spring-fed pond on its eastern edge had proved as reliable as its reputation suggested, carrying them through 2 dry summers without the anxiety that drought had previously brought to the ranch's water management. Augusta made her list for Dutch's supply wagon that summer with the comfortable authority of someone who knew exactly what she needed and why, and the list reflected a household that was thriving. Good provisions in generous quantities, spices and dried fruits for baking, enough variety to feed a crew of 10 men, and a growing family 3 meals a day with something that was worth eating. She added a note at the bottom of the list asking Dutch to inquire in town whether the general store was stocking any books on agricultural practice, because she had been thinking about crop rotation on the kitchen garden and wanted to read more about it. And she signed the note Augusta Cooper in the handwriting that was the same as it had been in Nashville, and would be the same as it was for all the years to come, steady and clear, and without unnecessary ornamentation. Abel came into the kitchen while she was finishing the list and stood behind her and read over her shoulder, with the unself-conscious ease of a man who had long since stopped performing the courtesies of distance. "Agricultural practice," he said. "For the garden," she said. He put his hands on her shoulders and she felt the familiar weight and warmth of them. "You're going to redesign the whole back section," he said. It was not a complaint. "The yield could be 30% better with proper rotation," she said. He made a sound that was equal parts admiring and resigned, which was a sound she was well acquainted with and which meant, approximately, she is going to do this thing and she is going to be right about it, and I am going to enjoy the results. He kissed the top of her head and went out to the yard, and she heard him calling to Garrett about something to do with the horses, and then the familiar sounds of the ranch in morning motion folded over each other. Boots on the porch steps and the creak of the barn door and the horses in the corral, responding to the day's activity, and James's voice somewhere from upstairs where he had apparently already figured out that he was awake and had things to do, and William's lesser but increasing contribution to the general sound of life in progress. Augusta put down her pen and looked at the kitchen around her, at the seasoned skillet on its hook, and the jars on the pantry shelf and the herbs in the window, and the stove with its banked fire, ready to come up at a moment's notice. She looked at the small table where she and Abel had eaten dinner on winter evenings, and the larger work table scarred from years of cooking for a crew, and the door to the small room that had been her room when she arrived and was now a pantry overflow, because she had long since moved into the ranch house proper, into the bedroom where Abel's father had died, and which Abel had lived in alone for 2 years before she came, and which now held beside the bed a cradle that would probably not be empty very much longer, because that was the particular direction their life together seemed to be going, and she was glad of it. She thought about happiness the way she thought about most things, which was practically and without excessive sentiment. Happiness, she had concluded, was not a condition that arrived and stayed. It was something you made day by day from the materials available to you, through the choices you made about how to spend your attention and what to put your hands to and who to stand beside in the long work of a life. She had made a good choice. She had made it the way she made everything, by looking at what was in front of her and assessing it honestly and deciding it was worth the effort. And then by doing the work. That was the whole of it. She got up to put more wood in the stove, because the crew would be in for breakfast in an hour, and there was no point in thinking philosophical thoughts when the fire needed building up. And she built the fire up with the same steady competence that she brought to everything. And then she went to the door and called up the stairs to James, who called back in the clear, certain voice of a child who is entirely sure of where he is and who loves him. And she went back to the stove and started the biscuits. Abel came back inside 20 minutes later with James on his shoulders and William in his arms, collected from upstairs by a man who had gone out to the yard, and come back in when he heard his children's voices, because that was who Abel Cooper was, a man who oriented toward the people he loved the way a compass oriented toward north, not by effort but by nature. He set William in the high chair that Walt had built from good oak last winter and lowered James to the floor, and James immediately went to inspect the stove situation, which was becoming a concern, because the boy had his mother's interest in how things worked and had recently begun developing theories about cooking that needed to be managed. Augusta handed James a spoon and showed him where he could legitimately stir something, which was a compromise that satisfied his scientific impulse without creating an emergency. And Abel poured himself coffee from the pot that was always ready and sat down at the kitchen table. And James stirred the thing he was allowed to stir with serious concentration. And William banged on the high chair tray with both hands in what he apparently believed was a constructive contribution to the morning. And the biscuits were going in the oven, and the coffee smelled the way it always did, strong and right, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table and the man sitting at it and the 2 small people who had come from both of them and who were becoming, steadily and daily, themselves. She had arrived in Redemption Creek in May of 1883 with 43 cents and a cast-iron skillet and no intention of staying. And she had stayed because she had never found a reason to leave. And that was the truest thing she knew about how the best parts of a life arrived, not on schedule and not according to plan, but in the form of a morning you had not expected to love, becoming the morning you could not imagine being without. The cottonwoods along the creek were coming into their summer green outside the kitchen window, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, and somewhere across the yard, Tommy Dawes was starting his morning with Clara in the small house Abel had helped him build on the east section, and the crew was stirring in the bunkhouse, and the ranch was waking up around them the way it woke up every morning, with the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable life of a working place that was also a home. And Augusta Cooper took the biscuits out of the oven and put them on the table and called her family to breakfast, and the day began.